What Russia did today crossed a line that NATO had desperately hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with overwhelming force, and with a message that reverberated from Moscow to Washington. This is the story of what happened in the last 48 hours, a story of escalation, of retaliation, and of a war that just entered a dangerous new phase. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official statements from the Kremlin, not formal announcements from Russian state media, just signals that Moscow was preparing something unprecedented. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain logic, a pattern, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in NATO headquarters this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military movements know the indicators, the rail traffic carrying ammunition to forward positions, the electronic signatures of command and control systems being activated, the repositioning of air defense assets to protect staging areas, the sudden increase in encrypted communications between field commanders. All of that went quiet. And whenever Russia goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Western satellites detected unusual activity near the Belgorod region, movements that didn't fit the normal operational tempo, supply convoys that appeared, moved, and then vanished from tracking, aircraft that took off from bases deep inside Russia and flew patterns that suggested rehearsals, not routine patrols. The pieces were moving. But to where? That question haunted NATO planners for days, and then, early this morning, they got their answer. Early Tuesday morning, NATO reconnaissance assets detected what they described as a large-scale cross-border operation, including missile strikes and ground incursions that had not been attempted in over 14 months. These are the kinds of operations that Russia only launches when they are signaling something very specific, a test of Ukrainian defenses, a message to Western allies, or a prelude to a larger offensive. NATO analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its strategic posture, and when a nuclear-armed power shifts posture without explanation, even by small measures, every intelligence agency on the planet pays attention. The strike targeted infrastructure in Ukraine's Sumy region, power substations, communication nodes, and what appears to have been a logistics hub that had been supporting Ukrainian operations for months. But this wasn't just another bombardment, this was different. Russia deployed assets that had been held in reserve, systems that analysts believed were being saved for a different phase of the conflict, weapons platforms that hadn't been seen in active combat since the earliest days of the invasion. The message was clear: Moscow was willing to escalate. The only question was how Kyiv would respond. The warning issued by NATO tonight was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic, it was urgent. Officials after an emergency meeting described Russia's move as provocative, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, potentially precedent-setting for further escalation. NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte convened an emergency session with member state representatives. The discussions, according to sources who spoke on condition of anonymity, were described as intense and focused on immediate contingencies. But escalation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most coordinated and devastating we've seen in the entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 6 hours of Russia's cross-border strike, Ukraine launched a multi-domain counter-offensive that targeted Russian military assets across at least 4 oblasts. These weren't the standard drone attacks we've seen in recent months. These were precision strikes using advanced Western-supplied systems, weapons that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to send an unmistakable message. Tonight, Ukrainian military sources confirmed that their forces launched coordinated strikes on Russian military positions, including a command center in Belgorod Oblast that had recently been activated for what analysts believe was the coordination of today's cross-border operation. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate its gains. They hit the command center, they hit ammunition depots that were supplying the forward units, They hit air defense systems that were likely preparing to provide cover for additional strikes. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of the operation, the infrastructure that would have made Russia's escalation sustainable. This is what made NATO's warning so urgent. Russia's cross-border strike wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could fundamentally alter the dynamics of the conflict if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't panic and disperse their resources. They didn't wait for international consultations. They hit the staging areas. They hit the supply lines. They hit the systems that Russia needs to sustain any prolonged operation. According to preliminary reports, Ukrainian strikes destroyed or damaged at least 12 military targets, including radar installations, fuel storage facilities, and what appears to have been a forward operating base that Russian forces had only established in the last 72 hours. Speed of Ukraine's response suggests that their intelligence on Russian movements was excellent, possibly better than Moscow anticipated, and that matters because in modern warfare, information is ammunition. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence officials now believe that Russia's latest move was designed to probe the resilience of Ukrainian defenses after months of grinding attrition and questions about Western support. Moscow wanted to see whether Kyiv would buckle under pressure, but instead the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't retreat. They launched a counter-offensive that was so swift, so precise that even Russian military bloggers noticed. You don't get Moscow's attention easily, but today Ukraine did. Defense analysts speaking with international media under anonymity described Russia's shift as coercive signaling, a way to test whether Ukraine and its allies would respond with unity or division. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and determined. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were timed so precisely that Russian forces had no opportunity to disperse or relocate. That timing matters because it shows something crucial about Ukrainian intelligence capabilities. It shows that Ukraine is not merely reacting to Russian aggression, they are anticipating it. This represents a fundamental shift in how this conflict is being fought. For months, the narrative has focused on Ukrainian defensive operations, holding the line, preserving territory, waiting for Western support. But today's response suggests something different. Ukraine is not waiting, they are acting, and they are acting with a sophistication that has clearly caught Moscow off guard. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian ground forces carried out targeted operations along the border region, forcing Russian units to abandon at least 2 forward positions. Ukrainian air defense successfully intercepted a significant portion of Russian missiles, limiting the damage to civilian infrastructure. Ukrainian drone units operating deep behind Russian lines reportedly struck logistics hubs used by Moscow to coordinate resupply operations. Special operations forces conducted reconnaissance missions that provided real-time intelligence for precision strikes. This wasn't just defense, this wasn't just retaliation, this was operational coordination, this was strategic integration, and strategic integration is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the early months of the invasion. For every tactical advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates their logistics, disrupts their command structure, or destroys their supplies. The mathematics of war are unforgiving, and tonight those mathematics favor Ukraine. Remember, Russia thought this would be over in days. They thought Kyiv would fall. They thought NATO would fracture. They thought the world would lose interest. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Kyiv stands defiant. NATO is more unified than it has been in decades. And the world is watching as Ukraine demonstrates that it will not be bullied into submission. 27 months into this conflict, Russia has failed to achieve any of its original strategic objectives. They have not captured Kyiv. They have not installed a puppet government, they have not divided the Western alliance, and they have not broken Ukrainian resolve. Every time Moscow has escalated, Ukraine has adapted. Every time Russia has launched a new offensive, Ukrainian forces have found ways to blunt it. And every time the Kremlin has issued threats, the international community has responded with increased support. This pattern is not accidental. It is the result of Ukrainian courage, Western commitment, and Russian miscalculation. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Russia's latest move happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under mounting domestic and international pressure. Hardliners in Moscow want faster progress. Military commanders want more resources. The Russian public, despite state propaganda, is growing weary of a war that has no visible end, and Western sanctions continue to constrain the Russian economy. Putin is balancing these demands while trying to maintain the fiction that everything is going according to plan. And when leaders in that position make sudden dramatic moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. Today's cross-border strike may have been intended to project power, but in reality, it revealed desperation, a desperate attempt to change the narrative, a desperate attempt to force Ukraine into a defensive posture, a desperate attempt to demonstrate relevance on a battlefield where Russian forces have been largely stalemated. Ukraine's response exposed that desperation for what it is. NATO's emergency statement, now distributed to all member states, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to allow further Russian escalation to go unanswered. Officials said plainly that Russia's cross-border strike was inconsistent with any genuine interest in de-escalation or peace. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and we're not going to let it stand. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO unless something serious is at stake. The alliance has already announced consultations under Article 4 of the NATO treaty, the provision that allows member states to request discussions when they believe their territorial integrity, political independence, or security is threatened. While Ukraine is not a NATO member, the alliance has made clear that instability on its eastern border is a matter of collective concern. Additional air patrols have been ordered along NATO's eastern flank. Surveillance assets have been repositioned, and member states have been asked to assess their readiness posture. This is not posturing. This is preparation. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a somber, determined speech tonight. He said, "Russia wants to test our resolve. They have tested it before, and every time they have found that we do not break." He said, "Our response today was not revenge, it was necessity. We will defend every meter of our land, every citizen of our nation." And he said to our partners around the world, "We are grateful for your support, but let there be no doubt Ukraine will fight, with or without. We prefer with, but we are prepared for either." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky has walked a careful line throughout this conflict, projecting strength while appealing for support, demonstrating resilience while acknowledging the costs. Tonight, that balance was on full display. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the cross-border strike, Belarusian military forces also conducted unusual exercises near the Ukrainian border. Russian naval assets in the Black Sea repositioned to what analysts describe as offensive postures. Russian cyber units increased activity targeting Ukrainian government systems. All of this happened within the same 48-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This is coordinated pressure, an attempt to stretch Ukrainian resources across multiple fronts to force difficult choices about where to defend and what to prioritize. But Ukraine has faced this before, and they have learned to respond. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing for a summer offensive. a final push to achieve territorial gains before potential diplomatic negotiations. Another is that Moscow is attempting to provoke a response that could be used to justify further escalation, including potential attacks on NATO supply lines. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to demonstrate that it can still escalate at will, hoping to undermine Western confidence in Ukraine's long-term prospects. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't hesitate. They didn't equivocate. They didn't wait for permission. They struck back with decisive force. And in doing so, they sent a message that resonated far beyond the battlefield. What we're watching now is a test of wills. Russia wants to see whether Ukraine will eventually exhaust itself. Ukraine wants to show that exhaustion is not an option. NATO wants to prevent this conflict from spiraling into a broader European war. And the international community wants to prevent the normalization of territorial conquest through military force. These interests are not always aligned, but tonight they're converging around a single point. Russia's escalation cannot be allowed to succeed. Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now closely monitoring the situation. They say Ukrainian forces performed exceptionally well under difficult circumstances. They say Russia's cross-border strike, while serious, did not achieve its apparent objectives. And they say Moscow's decision to escalate is likely part of a broader pressure campaign intended to force concessions before potential diplomatic windows open. But Ukraine is not conceding. In fact, Ukraine is pressing forward. Their response today, swift, coordinated, and devastating, sent a message to Russia that aggression will be met with consequences. And it sent a message to NATO that Ukraine remains a capable partner worth supporting. Western military aid continues to flow. Training programs continue to produce capable Ukrainian units. And the international coalition supporting Ukraine remains intact. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with today's cross-border strike. But what we do know is that NATO's response was timely. It reinforced the alliance's commitment to European security. It signaled to Moscow that further escalation will not go unnoticed, and it provided diplomatic cover for continued support to Ukraine. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 72 hours. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as a test that Moscow failed. If they double down, Ukraine and NATO have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be reconsidering. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Russia is quiet, it means they are calculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they have learned many times before. Ukraine will not be intimidated. NATO will not be divided. And the free world will not look away. This story is far from over, but tonight one thing is clear: Russia's gamble did not pay off. Ukraine's resolve remains unbroken, and the price of aggression continues to rise, and we will be here watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.